Good day and welcome to one of the final Hearts of Iron 4 dev diaries. I say final because I think now we're in the final month of dev diaries before the release of the DLC by Blood Alone. I say this not on guesswork because we now have an announcement of the release date of the DLC, the 27th of September. So heading into autumn we will find ourselves all playing the new DLC and whatever wonders might come with that. But don't worry, there is some more stuff to talk about. There's a modding dev diary to discuss, and a few other little tricks on the side I'd assume, possibly an achievements dev diary, and other features they might have missed. Because we're coming to the end, that means this dev diary is going to be talking about some minor things that have been added to the side to make life more qualitative. This dev diary is about quality of life improvements. Let's begin. So we head in thinking that first of all this was going to be a modding dev diary, which it isn't, it's about quality of life improvements, but the modding changes dev diary will be happening for those who are interested in that, just not this time. It's worth noting that these won't be all of the minor changes coming, there will be many other changes coming. These are just the changes that Paradox thought would be most impactful to talk about in this dev diary. The rest of them you're going to have to discover in the patch notes and complain about them on day one on the forums. So the first change to address is armor piercing, which is going to be talking about some changes coming to the way piercing works in regards to the formula they use for determining whether certain piercing attacks are going to push through the armor of things like tanks and ships. So prior to BBA, the way it worked was that if a division did not have a higher piercing stat than the armor value of the target they were attacking, then their overall attack would be reduced by a flat 50%. In the new formula, it's going to work on thresholds, so the amount that you can pierce will determine the output of the damage you can do. I don't like to spend too long talking about this kind of thing because when you get into the stats, you often find that A, many things change so often it's hard to keep track of what's actually working, and B, sometimes even though we could spend time talking about stats, the way they actually work in practice may be very different than what I, you, everyone else, and even Paradox themselves may think it works. That is to say, with Hoi 4, sometimes things are a little bit unreliable, so the best way to find out how things works is when you actually play the game in practice. But just to show you how this works in an image, they show here in the bottom right that damaged is now based on the amount of armor pierced, so if you're piercing less than 50%, you get the traditional 50% damage, but for every bit over 50%, going up to 100, you get a progression of tiers of the amount of damage you can do. In short, this is a nerf to armor because if you didn't meet the threshold, you got the negative 50. Now, let's say you've got around 50% of the piercing required, you should still be doing more than 50%, you're doing 65%, so a slight buff to piercing. They go on to describe that the buff towards piercing also applies to ships, so that now if you've got light guns that are capable of piercing through heavy armor, you can get greater critical hit chances, representing when a shell kind of hits the internal side of a ship, to get some much better damage. They also note that they've added a 200% pierced threshold, giving you a 300% critical chance, just in case you've got some super heavy guns that are capable of really just smashing through the armor of some small ships, and therefore you're going to get massive critical hit chance to do some serious damage. But once again, bear in mind, everything is subject to change, so who knows whether any of this will be relevant after the post DLC patches. Next up, we have a pretty neat little concept with the design comparison mechanic. So what it works is, if you're looking at something like tanks, ships and planes that all have their new designers, you now have the option to use another model that you already have access to and using it as a base to compare the stats of the tank that you're designing to. So let's say you're looking at a German Panzer tank and you've requested a license, so now you can use their base model as a reference to find out how good the model you're making wants to be. So in this image we can see that there is a comparison happening between a Panzer II light tank and the much stronger heavy tank with all of its bonus stats, but reduction on speed and reliability. So you can see how you can have both of them next to each other to determine what you're getting as an advantage and what you're perhaps losing out on. You can do this, as we can see on the right, with things you've captured as well. So the Germans here are building their tank, but they possibly have captured some British tanks when they maybe encircled a tank division, or when you capitulate a enemy and you take some of their equipment. You can use that as a baseline for things to compare to. And for people who own La Resistance, they're adding a new functionality so that countries that you have the highest intelligence tier for that particular designer, you can use to see their models of designs and use it to compare it with them. So Navy for ships, Army for tanks, and Air Force for planes. I feel this is going to be most useful, perhaps not so much for playing against AI, because AI usually sticks to a formula, and once you know the formula you can just play around that, but it's going to be more useful for multiplayer games. I can imagine people who are going for better multiplayer strategies would involve knowing what your enemy's building, knowing what equipment they've gone for, and then building things that specifically counter or have ever so slightly more armor/piercing than what they have armor and piercing, so you can counter them better and get those advantages. In terms of having to know what your opponent AI equipment is, I'm not sure it's too useful, but if you're role-playing and you want to find out what's going on, then I guess it works for that too. So next up, we've got perhaps what is quite a dramatic change in the form of war support. They're changing war support in how it's going to be applied and how you're going to get it. They described that they felt that war support had plummeted in terms of relevance due to the power creep of countries' content, I guess focus trees that give you war support and abilities that give you ticking war support, as well as the decisions to use political power to gain weekly war support if you're at war with a country. So, since they consider that war support is supposed to be a representation of your people and your military's desire to continue fighting a war, they're adding a new effect that comes with war support, the stability debuff while at war for war support. So as we see here, we've got a war support with, that's a base value of 70, and they're getting negative 12% stability at war because of they don't have maximum war support. So this means going forward that war support is going to have a scaling negative effect on the country's stability, meaning that the less war support you have, maybe you're losing war heroes and aces are dying and stuff like that, the country's going to get less and less stable. Because they're trying to make war support something you have to care about more as well, they're going to make it much more, let's say, rare to attain. Ticking war support decisions have been removed, although some of them have been changed into flat bonuses, they say, but I'm pretty sure like the war propaganda decisions are just flat out gone. Losing units/manpower, it says taking casualties, so that's kind of an obscure wording, but taking casualties is going to contribute to a ticking war support negative debuff. So the more you lose, the more people are going to be unhappy, as well as other things contributing to it, such as strategic bombing making people unhappy. And they say here sunk convoys, which I could imagine being very unbalanced if perhaps somebody has forgotten to guard their convoys, or if some convoys are taking some interesting shipping routes and are getting bombed unknowingly. Oh no, I hope that isn't going to be bad, but all in all, lots of things are going to start ticking down war support. Because there's more ways to lose war support, and they've gotten rid of ways to gain war support, they did add some small changes. They're adding some decisions which, instead of giving you war support, are going to try and mitigate some of the issues that come with the detractive war support. So we see here the decision Exhort Heroism, which is going to give you weekly war support for combat casualties. So I guess that means that this is a buff to counter the debuff, so that as your war support goes down, the war support malus, which is what you're getting from losing ships, bombings, losing units, is going to be countered by this decision. Going forward, I also see like Encourage Frugality, which is probably for navy losses, and Bolster Spirits for when you lose your aces, etc., etc. So, To round that up, that means that once you get your war support to as high as you can through focuses, events, the main core ways that you'll do that, that's it. That's all you've got. There's no decisions you can spend with late game political power. It's just you have what you have, and you're going to have to spend the rest of the time dealing with the debuffs you're getting from the inability to have 100 war support. With something so dramatic as this, it's hard sometimes to give a good reaction because it doesn't seem as an immediate good or bad. It requires playing. But if I were to give an initial reaction, I'd say I hope that it doesn't impact the traditional gameplay of kind of building up the nation to ready to go to war, getting things like partial mob, if you're fash, going for like a war economy, because the war support was so entwined in some other aspects of the game that losing that aspect to make it a slightly different mechanic in regards to the people's desire is not going to work in my mind as fluidly with things like the economy law for going to war. TLDR, if you're not playing a major nation like Germany or something else, I can imagine it being pretty slightly more difficult to get your economy law up if there's not going to be decisions like this where we previously could just get a ticking weekly war support. So that means those nations are maybe not going to be able to get high war like economy laws unless they go to war. And if they're offensive, they're getting debuffs, so they're never going to be able to do it. And that means that any nation that doesn't have the ability to get to a high enough is going to struggle a bit more. I guess if you're playing as a nation which has no like content or focus tree, getting a leader that spawns with the hawk as a trait is going to be a big deal. Armoured trains and logistic strikes. So they've made some changes to how armoured trains and logistic strikes is going to work, because if some of you had noticed, logistic strikes were getting pretty bad in terms of supply, especially in terms of your trains not being on time. They say that this has been fixed. On the flip side, they also had an issue that armoured trains were not getting attacked by logistic strikes. So while one was ridiculously overpowered, the other had absolutely no effect at all, and that meant that if you built armoured trains, you could just get away scot-free, which I might have abused myself sometimes. This has now been fixed so that armoured trains can be defeated. They have made them slightly less completely destructible though, because they do have some air attack, meaning that if the enemy is doing logistic strike against armoured trains, they run the risk of losing some of those planes trying to commit to the attacks. AI tank strategy. So far as I can understand, they've made it so that AI will be more focused on sticking tanks in places where it would make more sense to have tanks. So maybe not sticking tanks on mountain tiles or in the depths of Siberia where there's no supply, and sticking them in places like the African front and using them in the core of Europe on the plains and such. They do describe, though, that they haven't added the ability for them to do very well thought out pincer encirclements, but that it is something they are considering adding for the future. And lastly, we have a nice simple change with allied logistics. So when you're looking at your logistics tab, which is the little notepad with a pen, you will be able to look at the logistics menu for people that you have as subjects, your puppets, and faction members through the diplomacy menu. So this means you can find out what your friends and puppets have in terms of supply, so you can better choose what to give them in a lend-lease. I mean, when you're playing with multiplayer, they can tell you, I guess, if you're in a call with them or talking to them in chat, but in general, when it comes to the AI and people who are less social, having the ability to see what they are lacking, what they need, and giving them the appropriate equipment means you can better manage the overall war situation. And that, I do believe, is that. I believe that's the end of that, not too bold dev diary, but I think in terms of the war support and the earlier stuff, there could be some significant changes there, perhaps some game-breaking changes, so I'm a little bit worried, but well, don't judge a book until you've read it, so I guess we'll have to play it and find out first. If I was to suggest a quality of life change, something that I would really like, which is, again, not major, but really improves the game experience, I'd hope that they go through and rework the advisors in the game. Not necessarily adding new ones or anything, but looking at countries that have advisors and maybe rethinking some of them. So this DLC is going to be about Ethiopia, but I don't know how many people know this, but almost every African country has the exact same advisors, all of them. They have the same ones. And one of them, so what he does is he gives them a buff, or a reductive buff in some cases, to subversive activities. This means justifying on them is much longer, like 30%, which is just painful, and it means that them doing anything is more difficult. So you can end up with these just really annoying nations in the game that take forever to go to war with, despite them being so small. So going around, especially around Ethiopia, and making sure some of these countries like Sudan perhaps don't have those really annoying advisors would be good. As well as going back in and making sure that every country in the game has advisors and military high command and chiefs of the army and navy, because there are still quite a few nations in the game that don't actually have that. All the Spanish releasables don't, like Navarra, Catalonia, Galicia. Some of the new nations they added with No Step Back don't have advisors, like Silesia and Gdynia or whatever it's called. So yeah, definitely having a quick look at some of the advisors in the game and having a change around for some of them, I think could mean a lot. So that's about it. That's my 2p. Tell me what your thing would be as a quality of life change. What would you like to see change as a small little problem or iffy thing that you think might be improved with a few lines of code changed? I mean, there could be tons of them. Like, why is John Curtin leader of Australia in 1936? I never understood that. I thought it was Joseph Lyons. Little stuff like that you just go, about. So yeah, tell me what you think. We probably have, 3 or 4 more dev diaries. One about achievements, one about modding. The final one will be changelog, I can imagine. Maybe a cheeky one on the side. So yeah, not too much left. We'll cover all of it, and that's about it. So if you liked, feel free to like, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.